This is the Book Legion Podcast, where we review thought-provoking books to give our Legionnaires the knowledge they need to dominate the next level of their life.
Welcome back to the Book Legion, friends. This is Kevin Diaz. Hope everyone listening has been well since last tuning into the podcast. We're actually going to be switching it up a little bit today with the book that I'm going to be covering. In the past, we've been pretty heavy on the personal development, / sales books here on the Book Legion, and just wanted to give you, the listeners, something different in the form of a little history lesson. That book is titled The President and the Freedom Fighter by Brian Kilmeade. It's a story about Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul. A little bit about the author, Brian. He's a television and radio host for Fox News. You can find him on Fox and Friends pretty much every weekday morning. And he's got his own show called One Nation that he hosts on the weekends. And I didn't really know this, but until I read it, but he's written several books, centered around major American historical figures. Those books are George Washington's Secret Six, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, and Andrew Jackson's Miracle of New Orleans. If you know me, I'm a huge fan of history, and I think that Brian did a really, really good job bringing forth the stories about these two historical figures in a way that I personally hadn't heard before. I don't think a lot of people have, especially that of the life of Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery. And the fascinating thing about this book is that Lincoln and Douglass are tackling this issue of slavery from two different angles. Okay. And with Douglass being obviously passionate about tackling it head on, while Lincoln was more cautious on how to deal with it because he was afraid that it would ultimately lead to war, which obviously it did. And there's this tension throughout the book between the personal calendars that Douglass is on and from the one that Lincoln is on. And, it's easy to look back now and think, oh, why didn't they just, pass a ban on slavery? They cared about it so much. And I think people fail to realize that there's unfortunately, even a political game to play with things such as slavery. I mean, it still happens today. It's still the same game. It's just the topic that changes, right? So how many delegates do we have? Do we have enough votes in the Senate? All that sort of a conversation needed to happen. And as well as other questions like, where was the country at the time? Are they willing to accept that these would-be former slaves, would they be willing to accept them as countrymen? Like, those are all questions that had to be figured out, particularly on the Lincoln camp, right, on the Lincoln side of things, in order to address slavery properly and not too quickly. Because as you read, you see that Lincoln knew that if he went at Douglass's speed, he would end up having no country to govern, as the North was just not ready to fight specifically for the freedom of the slaves. And so you have this back and forth throughout really, decades of the characters knowing each other, where they seem to want the same thing, but Douglass is just not able to see that long-term vision that Lincoln had, which infuriates him. And it even makes Douglass feel, they quote his writings, that the cause for abolition has been fake, that Lincoln is kind of this sort of false prophet that said all the right things, but ultimately he's not going to do anything about it. And you see throughout the book this really beautiful transformation of the character of Lincoln, transformed through his youth, even up to his old age, right before his assassination. He is constantly learning. He is constantly transforming his views. And he even admits that in his youth and early career, he despised slavery as he saw it being a great hypocrisy. He is quoted as saying, how can we be a country of freedom when we have an entire group of people that is deprived of their human rights? It was a great hypocrisy. So he despised slavery from a moral standpoint. And but even still, he is a man of his time. He's quoted in the book that he didn't see the Black man as his equal, which shocked me, because the image that's been cultivated of Lincoln in modern times is just, you would think that he was always for giving slaves the right to vote, citizenship, all that stuff, abolish slavery. And that wasn't the case. He truly was a man of his time. And it's a lesson to take away from the book is that it goes to show that when we look back at history, we need to remind ourselves that people really are truly from their time to no fault of their own. And I think that's what makes Lincoln's story truly amazing, this transformation that even though he's a man of his time, he goes through these changes and sees this progress against slavery. He even calls last time that Frederick Douglass and him meet prior to his assassination, he calls Frederick his friend. And for a black man to be in the White House at that time in this nation's history was never really, seen before. So I think it's a great book. I recommend it. It's just over 200 pages. It's not a long read. It's an easy read. We'll put the link in the description, the Amazon link for it. Highly recommend it. And I appreciate you guys for hopping on and listening to the Book Legion today. And until next time.